They forced a human mother to relinquish her son. An ancient species chose war instead. The door was already open when they arrived. Not because my mother had heard them coming. Not because she was welcoming them in. The door was open because she had been standing in the hallway since 4 in the morning, holding a cold cup of coffee, reading a document on her tablet that she had already read 47 times. I know the number because she told me later. She said she had been counting. My name is Cale Marin. I was 19 years old when 3 Veth proctors walked into our quarters on Conclave Station and told my mother she had 60 seconds to say goodbye to me. She did not say goodbye. She said, "You have 1 hour to leave his file open for appeal." They denied it in 40 seconds. Not even a full minute. The lead proctor, a creature that stood nearly 2 meters tall in white exoskeletal armor, clicked its mandibles twice, in what I had learned was the Veth equivalent of a polite refusal, and then it looked at me, not at her, and said in clipped standard, "Cultural Bridge Asset Marin, Cale. You will come with us now." I looked at my mother. Her face did not break. It did not crumble. It did not do any of the things a face is supposed to do when someone is about to lose the only person in the world they love. She looked at me with those careful, gray eyes, the same eyes she used when she was studying a biological sample that was behaving in a way she had not predicted, and she said, very quietly, "Remember your kitchen code." I did not know what that meant yet. I thought it was grief talking. I thought it was her mind reaching for something familiar, because the present moment was too painful to hold on to. Kitchen code was a cipher she had invented when I was 7 years old, a way of writing notes in markets and crowded stations so that nobody else could read them. We used it to write grocery lists, to pass silly messages during boring diplomatic functions. It was a small, private thing between the two of us, and I thought she was saying it because she wanted me to hold on to something small and private in whatever came next. I was wrong about almost everything that morning, but I was most wrong about that. The proctors walked me out. The hallway was empty. The station's third shift lighting was still on, the soft amber glow that told you it was the middle of the night, even if you were 200 light-years from any star that had a proper night. My footsteps made sounds on the metal floor. Theirs did not. The Veth were extraordinarily quiet when they moved, and that silence felt like a hand pressed over my mouth. I did not look back. I knew that if I looked back I would see my mother still standing in the doorway, and I did not want that to be the last image I carried of her. So I looked forward, and I memorized the shape of the proctor's armor, the way the station lights reflected off its carapace, the exact cadence of my own breathing. 19 years old. That is how old I was. Let me tell you what kind of 19 years old I was. I had grown up on Conclave Station. It is not a place most humans grow up. It orbits a neutral star called Varus Point, equidistant from 7 major galactic civilizations, and it exists for one purpose: to give those civilizations somewhere to talk to each other, without anyone having home field advantage. The architecture is deliberately confusing. No single species designed it. Sections were built by different hands across different centuries, and the result is a structure that feels, no matter where you are in it, like you have accidentally walked into a room that was meant for someone else. My mother brought me here when I was 2 years old. She had accepted an embedded research position with the Veth Dominion's Xenobiology Corps, the only human scientist ever to hold such a post. The Veth are extraordinarily selective about who they allow into their academic institutions, and my mother had spent 10 years earning that invitation. She was the kind of scientist who did not just study alien biology. She studied alien thinking. She said that biology was just the hardware, and that what she was really interested in was the software, the way different nervous systems produced different kinds of minds. I grew up surrounded by different kinds of minds. By the time I was 6, I spoke Standard, Veth Primary, and 2 regional dialects of a language called Lithani, which is spoken by a cephalopod civilization in the 4th arm of the galaxy, and has no words for individual ownership, because the Lithani do not have a concept of mine. I was a strange child by human standards. I sat too still. I asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. I had almost no human friends because there were almost no humans on the station, and I had a small number of alien friends who found my stillness and my questions to be perfectly normal. The Veth found me exceptional. I did not know, for a long time, that exceptional was a dangerous word in their vocabulary. The Veth Dominion is 40,000 years old. That is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Their recorded history spans 40 millennia, and their pre-recorded history, which they have reconstructed through genetic archaeology, stretches back even further. They have been a spacefaring civilization since before humans discovered agriculture. They have fought wars that lasted centuries. They have absorbed, assimilated, and occasionally erased dozens of smaller civilizations that stood in the path of their expansion. They are not cruel. That is one of the first things my mother taught me about them, and it is the most important thing to understand if you want to understand what happened to me. The Veth are not cruel. They do not take pleasure in domination. They genuinely, sincerely believe that Veth culture represents the highest form of civilizational achievement yet produced in this galaxy, and they believe, with the same sincerity, that any being who is exposed to Veth culture and found to have a natural aptitude for it is simply better off becoming part of it. This belief has a formal mechanism. It is called the Assimilation Clause, and it exists within the broader Galactic Conclave Treaty framework, the same framework that governs interstellar trade, territorial boundaries, and diplomatic relations between the major powers. The Assimilation Clause states, in formal language that was summarized to the human diplomatic team as a standard cultural exchange provision, that any miner residing within Dominion-controlled space, or employed territory, who demonstrates measurable cognitive resonance with Dominion cultural matrices may be designated a cultural bridge asset and placed under the care of the Dominion for integration purposes. Humans were shown 3 pages of a 17-page document when they signed the treaty. I scored perfectly on the Veth cognitive resonance examinations. I scored so perfectly that I was flagged by 3 separate review committees. I spoke their language without accent. I understood their philosophical frameworks intuitively. I ate their food without complaint. I had spent 17 years absorbing Veth culture through proximity to my mother's research, and the Veth looked at me and saw something they recognized, one of their own, accidentally born in a human body. They told my mother 6 days before they came for me. 6 days. She was given 6 days to appeal, to argue, to negotiate, to do whatever human parents do when their child is being taken from them by a 40,000-year-old empire that has the legal authority to do exactly what it is doing. She spent those 6 days filing documents, not appeals, not protests, not emotional petitions to the Conclave's Humanitarian Committee, which would have taken months to process and years to resolve. She filed 41 separate documents to 41 separate bodies, trade oversight boards, biological ethics committees, historical precedent archives, treaty interpretation panels, and one department within the human government's Foreign Relations Office that had no official public name and a filing address that took her 3 days to locate. I did not know she was doing this. She did not tell me. She made dinner every evening. She asked about my reading. She laughed at things I said. She was so completely, perfectly normal in those 6 days that I genuinely did not understand the situation was as serious as it was. On the 6th night, she made the coffee she always made when she was going to stay up all night working. It was terrible coffee. She knew it was terrible. She had a gift for making terrible coffee, and she made a full pot of it and sat at her desk and worked until 4 in the morning. Then she walked into the hallway and stood there, reading a document she had already read 47 times. Then they came. I did not look back. The transport ship was clean and quiet, and smelled faintly of the compound the Veth used to sanitize their living spaces, a sharp, mineral smell, like fresh stone after rain. I was given a small cabin with a narrow sleeping surface, a reading console preloaded with Veth educational material, and a meal schedule that had been precisely calibrated to Veth nutritional standards rather than human ones. The food was not unpleasant. The Veth were very good at making food that was technically nutritious and entirely flavorless. There were 2 other humans on the transport. Both were cultural bridge assets like me. One was a girl named Petra who was 16 and had grown up in a human colony that existed inside Veth Dominion territory. She cried for the first 3 hours and then stopped, very abruptly, and did not cry again. The other was a boy named Owen, who was 22, and had been through this process before. He had been released once, on a technicality, and then redesignated when the technicality was resolved. He was the calmest person I had ever met. He told me, without being asked, that the Veth indoctrination facility was not a bad place to live. "It is not a bad place," he said. "That is the worst thing about it." I asked him what he meant. If it were terrible, he said, you would know who you were fighting against. It is very comfortable, and very slow, and very patient, and one day you will look in a mirror, and you will not recognize the person looking back at you, and you will not even know exactly when that happened. That is what they are good at. They are 40,000 years old, and they are very good at patience. I thought about my mother standing in that hallway. I thought about her voice saying, "Remember your kitchen code." I thought about her face, which had not broken. I decided, somewhere in the quiet of that transport cabin, that I was going to be careful. I was going to watch everything. I was going to be the kind of patient that 19-year-olds are not supposed to be capable of, because my mother had spent my entire life teaching me, without ever using the word, that observation is the most powerful tool in the universe. The facility, when we arrived, was exactly as Owen had described. It sat on the second moon of a Veth agricultural world, a place of wide, flat plains and blue-gray vegetation, and a sky that was always the color of deep water. The facility itself was architecturally beautiful. The Veth built things that were meant to last, and they built them with a sense of proportion that was, even to a human eye, genuinely lovely. High ceilings, long windows, corridors that curved gently rather than cutting at right angles, because Veth biology found sharp angles mildly stressful. There were 31 cultural bridge assets resident when I arrived. They came from 11 different species. Most had been there for more than a year. Some had been there for much longer. They moved through the facility with the quiet, unhurried ease of people who had accepted the rhythms of the place, who had allowed those rhythms to replace the rhythms they had arrived with. I watched them. I watched the way they walked, the way they held their bodies, the way they spoke in Veth primary more naturally than in their own languages, the way they used Veth social gestures without noticing they were doing it. I watched and I catalogued, and I began to understand, with a cold and very clear kind of understanding, exactly what Owen had meant. They were not unhappy. That was the thing. They were not prisoners who had been broken. They were people who had been reshaped, carefully and gently, and over a long period of time, until the shape they were was Veth adjacent enough to be useful. My cultural mentor was a Veth, named Liaison Proctor Vethsa. She was smaller than most Veth I had known, with a coloring that was unusual, pale yellow-gray, rather than the typical dark amber, and she moved with a kind of deliberate delicacy that suggested she was aware, always, of how large she appeared to the smaller beings in her care. She was kind, genuinely kind. She brought me reading material that she thought would interest me. She asked about my mother's research, with what seemed like real curiosity. She called my mother my previous caretaker, in a tone so gentle and so natural that the first 3 times I heard it, I almost did not notice the word she had chosen. The 4th time I noticed. I began my journal on the 3rd day. I found a physical notepad in a supply cabinet, an unusual thing in a facility where everything was digital, and I took it as a small gift from chance. And I began writing in my mother's kitchen code. Small, cramped letters that looked, to anyone who did not know the cipher, like decorative marks or personal notation. I wrote everything. Every change in my meal schedule, every small shift in the ambient lighting, every new piece of Veth cultural material that appeared on my reading console, as the human material quietly disappeared. I wrote the names of the other assets. I wrote conversations. I wrote, on the 7th page, the observation that had been forming in my mind since the first morning, that they were not trying to erase us. They were trying to fill us up, so slowly and so pleasantly that we would not notice we were being filled, until there was no empty space left for anything that had been there before. I wrote, they are not cruel. That is what makes them dangerous. Cruelty leaves marks. Patience leaves nothing. On the 19th day, Liaison Proctor Vethsa left a terminal unlocked. I have thought about this moment many times since. I have turned it over and examined it from every angle. I have asked myself whether it was an accident or a test or something in between. I have never arrived at a certain answer. What I know is that I was in the common study area, and she stepped away to take a communication, and the terminal she had been using was still open on the treaty database, and I am my mother's son. I read fast. I have always read fast. My mother could never understand why her colleagues read so slowly, when she could move through a dense scientific paper in less than an hour, and retain all of it. I think it is something she passed to me, this ability to take in text quickly and completely. and I used every bit of it in those 4 minutes, while Vethsa stood in the corridor with her back to me. I searched for the assimilation clause, not the 3-page summary that had been shown to the human diplomatic team. The full document, all 17 pages. I found page 9 on the 3rd minute. There was a subclause. It was written in old treaty language, the formal and slightly archaic phrasing that indicated it had been inserted into the original framework before the modern standard was established. It stated that no assimilation claim could stand valid if the designated minor retained primary cultural identity markers as assessed by a neutral witness body, and if the claiming party could not demonstrate willing parental consent, obtained without duress, whether implicit or explicit. My mother had not signed anything. My mother had said one sentence and been denied in 40 seconds. I closed the terminal. I sat back in my chair. I picked up a piece of Veth educational material and held it in my hands as Vethsa came back into the room, and I kept my face exactly still because she was watching me. She was always watching me, with that gentle, careful attention, and I did not want her to see anything in my expression that would tell her what I had just found. I went back to my room that night. I opened my journal. In kitchen code, in the smallest letters I could manage, I wrote one word, found. Then I wrote, below it, a question my mother had never actually answered, but that I suddenly, completely understood. Why, of all the things she could have said to me that morning in the doorway, had she chosen those 3 words? Because she knew I would need them. Not to write grocery lists, not to pass notes. She had known, perhaps not with certainty, but with that deep, prepared certainty of a scientist who has run the numbers and calculated for every outcome, that if I ever found something that needed to be hidden, I would know how to hide it. She had been preparing me for this moment since I was 7 years old, and somewhere, on Conclave Station, she was not sitting in grief. She was not waiting. She was working. She had been working since the moment that door closed. I knew it with the same conviction that I knew the cipher, the same bone-deep certainty that I knew the sound of her footsteps in the hallway outside my room at night. I did not know what she was doing, but I knew her, and I knew that she had not let them take me. She had sent me in. On the 22nd day, I heard from Owen that a human ship had appeared at the outer edge of Dominion space. He said it quietly, almost as an aside, leaning against the wall in the dining area, while Vethsa spoke to 2 other assets at the far end of the room. He said it the way you say something when you are not sure whether it is important. I kept my face still. Just one? I asked. One, he said. Nobody knows why. It is not doing anything. It is just sitting there. I looked down at my food, my Veth nutritional, precisely calibrated, perfectly flavorless food. I thought about my mother standing in a hallway at 4 in the morning. It will not be one for long, I said. Owen looked at me. How do you know that? I did not answer him, but in my room that night, I wrote in the journal, she is coming. Not here. She is coming for the whole thing. And for the first time since the door closed, I allowed myself to feel something other than careful. I allowed myself to feel, just for a moment, the particular warmth that comes from knowing exactly who is in your corner, and understanding, at last, the full scope of what that person is capable of. My mother was coming. Not with grief, not with anger, with everything she had spent 19 years quietly building. The first thing I want to explain is that I do not alarm easily. My name is Sarathea, and I am a high witness of the Elhari continuance. The continuance has existed for 212,000 years, and in that time we have seen empires rise to heights that made other civilizations despair of ever reaching them, and then we have watched those same empires collapse under the weight of their own certainty. We have watched stars die. We have watched species go to war over the pronunciation of a single word and then, 1,000 years later, forget entirely why they had been fighting. I do not alarm easily. I have not experienced rapid pulse modulation, the Elhari equivalent of a racing heartbeat, in 11,000 years. The last time it happened, a rogue stellar object passed within 3 light-years of an inhabited system, and there were exactly 48 hours to calculate whether it would cause catastrophic damage. It did not. I recorded the event and moved on. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the weight of what I am about to say. When I received the alert that a single human ship had taken up a stationary position at the outer edge of Veth Dominion territorial space, I felt my pulse modulate. Not much. Just once. Just enough to notice. I had been assigned to the Human Observation Portfolio for 3 years at that point. It was considered, within the continuance, to be one of the lighter assignments. Humans were young, embarrassingly young by galactic standards, barely 200 years into interstellar travel. And while they were interesting in the way that all young species are interesting, they had not yet done anything that required the kind of sustained, intense observation we devoted to civilizations that had demonstrated either exceptional potential or exceptional danger. My senior counsel had given me the assignment with the tone they used when they thought something might be worth watching, but were not prepared to commit serious resources to it. I had been watching Elena Marin for most of those 3 years. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in my work. I was not assigned to Elena Marin specifically. I was assigned to human activity in and around Conclave Station, and Elena Marin happened to be the most interesting human on the station, and probably the most interesting human in that sector of the galaxy. She was not the most powerful. She was not the most connected. She held no official diplomatic position. She was a xenobiologist with an unusual research portfolio and a son who had tested as cognitively exceptional on Veth metrics, and those two facts, taken together, were what kept pulling my attention back to her. I want to tell you what I observed in the 6 days between when the Veth issued their designation notice and when they came for her son. She slept between 4 and 6 hours each night. She ate regularly. She maintained her professional schedule without deviation. She attended 2 social functions she had already committed to attending, and at both of them she was warm and present and apparently unbothered. The only change in her behavior pattern that a casual observer would have noticed was that she spent more time than usual in front of her desk terminal. I am not a casual observer. She filed 41 documents in 6 days. I counted each one. I tracked the destination of each one. Most of them went to bodies that had no obvious connection to her situation: a trade oversight board, a committee on biological research ethics, an archive of historical treaty precedents, and 3 separate panels whose mandate dealt with questions of treaty interpretation that had not been formally raised in decades. The last document went somewhere that required me to cross-reference 4 separate registration databases before I could confirm it was a real address. It went to a department within the human government's foreign relations structure that had no public-facing name, no listed personnel, and a founding date that was, when I finally traced it, approximately 8 years before the Veth first formally notified the human government that Kale Marin was being considered for Cultural Bridge designation. 8 years. I sat with that number for a long time. She had started preparing 8 years ago. I brought this to my senior counsel. I put the data in front of them, and I explained what I had found, and I told them that in my assessment, Elena Marin was not grieving. She was executing a plan she had begun building 8 years in advance, which meant she had known for 8 years, or had prepared as though she had known, that this moment was coming. My counsel considered this for approximately 4 minutes. Then they told me that humans grieved in unusual ways, and that what I was interpreting as preparation was most likely an individual's coping mechanism dressed up in the structure of productivity. They told me to continue monitoring, but not to escalate. I went back to my station. I watched the human ship that had appeared at the edge of Dominion space. It was a mid-class vessel, not a warship by design, though it had been modified in ways that suggested it was not purely civilian either. It broadcast no aggressive signals. It sent no demands. It simply sat there, in the cold and the dark between the stars, and it waited. One ship. I filed a notation in my personal log. Human vessel at Dominion boundary. Behavior: passive holding. Assessment: precursor, not culmination. My counsel did not ask to see that notation. On the 9th day after the boy was taken, a second ship appeared. On the 13th day, 3 more. On the 17th day, 4 additional vessels arrived over the course of 18 hours. They did not cluster. They did not form the kind of grouped formation that military doctrine across most galactic civilizations uses when preparing a show of force. They spread out. Each one took a position that, when I mapped them, corresponded to a specific node in the Veth Dominion's commercial routing network. Resupply corridors, trade junctions, the invisible threads of logistics that connected Dominion colonies to their home worlds and to each other. I mapped every position. I ran projections on every shipping route. I calculated the impact of a stationary obstruction at each node, and then I sat very still for a long time, because what I was looking at was not a military flanking maneuver. It was not the posturing that young civilizations typically use when they want to appear threatening. It was something far more considered. It was an economic siege in the making, not an attack, not a blockade in the traditional sense. The ships were not preventing traffic. They were not firing on anything. They were not even broadcasting warnings. They were simply present at every critical junction, waiting, and their presence alone was enough to make any trader in the region think very carefully about whether their cargo was worth moving, while unknown vessels sat at every waypoint like stones dropped in a river. I calculated the effect on Veth commerce. Then I recalculated it. Then I pulled in data from the Continuance's economic archives covering 6,000 years of interstellar trade patterns, and I ran the numbers against every precedent I could find. What I found was this: if those ships stayed where they were, and if more ships arrived to fill the remaining nodes, which my projections suggested was likely, the Veth Dominion would begin experiencing supply shortages to 3 outlying colony clusters within 60 days. Not catastrophic shortages, not immediately, but steady, compounding, deeply inconvenient shortages that would grow worse with each week that passed, and would be very difficult to address without either moving the human ships by force, which carried its own set of consequences, or giving the humans what they wanted. I felt my pulse modulate again. Twice in 3 weeks. A personal record for the modern era. I filed an escalation request with my senior counsel. I attached my projections. I outlined my assessment in formal continuance language, which is required to be precise and is forbidden from being emotional, and I used every bit of that precision to make clear that what I was observing was not a young civilization lashing out in anger. It was a young civilization executing a strategy that had been designed by someone who understood, at a deep level, how Dominion logistics worked and where the pressure points were. My counsel reviewed the escalation request overnight. They approved a modest increase in my observation resources. They still did not consider the situation a formal continuance concern. On the 22nd day, the human ambassador arrived at Conclave Station. Her name was Minister Ada Voss. She was a small woman, small even by human standards, with silver hair cut very short, and the kind of posture that suggests a person has decided, at some point in their life, that they will never again allow anything to make them appear small. She walked into the station with 3 aides and a document case that she carried herself rather than allowing anyone else to carry it, and she went directly to the scheduling office of the Veth Brood Council's diplomatic liaison and requested an emergency session. She was offered a session in 11 days. She accepted it. Then she went to her quarters, set up her workspace, and began making calls. I was monitoring the communication traffic and I could not decrypt the content. Human encryption has improved considerably in the past century, but I could track the volume and frequency. In her first 14 hours on the station, she made 63 separate communications. The Veth Brood Council noticed the human fleet. Of course they noticed. They were 40,000 years old, and their intelligence apparatus was extraordinary. They noticed, and they discussed, and they concluded, in the measured tone of a civilization that has weathered far greater threats than this, that the humans were making a point. A significant point, well executed for a young species, but ultimately, a point that the Dominion could weather without concession. They were not wrong, exactly. They were wrong about the part that mattered. They were thinking about the fleet. They should have been thinking about the woman who had filed 41 documents in 6 days. I attended the emergency session when it finally occurred. As a high witness of the Elhari continuance, I have permanent observer status in all formal conclave proceedings, which means I can sit in any chamber I choose, silent and unacknowledged, as long as I do not interfere. I have used this right more times than I can count. I have sat in chambers where wars were declared and peace was signed, and civilizations ended themselves with words. I had never seen anything quite like what Ada Voss did in that chamber. She sat across from the Veth High Brood Council, 7 of them, ancient and imposing in their ceremonial carapace coverings, each one representing more consecutive years of civilizational authority than the entire human species had been sapient, and she set her document case on the table. She did not open it immediately. She said, in flawless Veth primary dialect, with an accent that was so precise it was almost a performance. You took a human child from his mother under a treaty provision that was misrepresented to the human diplomatic team at the time of signing. I want to be very clear that I am not here to argue about whether your legal authority to take him was real. It was real. The assimilation clause exists. You had the right to invoke it. She paused. I am here to tell you that you had the right, and you chose to use it, and now you will deal with the consequences of that choice. The lead brood council member, a creature so old that its amber carapace had gone nearly white, said, in tones that managed to be both polite and deeply dismissive, Minister Voss, we recognize the difficulty this situation presents for your species. However, the Cultural Bridge program has functioned without incident for 11,000 years, she said. Yes, I have read the full history. She opened the document case. So have our lawyers. She placed the documents on the table. Page 9 of the assimilation clause was on top. I watched the lead brood council member look at the page. I watched the moment of recognition cross its face. A subtle shift in its compound eyes. A slight adjustment of its mandible positioning. That in Veth body language means, I was not expecting this. It was gone in less than a second. But I saw it. Minister Voss said, Subclause 9 requires willing parental consent, obtained without duress, explicit or implicit. Elena Marin said one sentence, and was denied in 40 seconds. She did not sign any document. She was not given the opportunity to genuinely evaluate or negotiate the claim. The consent condition was not met. The claim is invalid. The Conclave's humanitarian panel has an extensive review process for. We are not using the humanitarian panel, she said. We are invoking neutral witness arbitration, under the original treaty framework. The same framework that contains the assimilation clause contains the arbitration mechanism. It requires a witness body of the Alhari continuance to assess whether primary cultural identity markers remain intact in the designated minor. She looked directly at me. Every Veth on the council looked directly at me. I am accustomed to being in a room and being looked at. I am very old and my presence tends to have a weight that even species who have never encountered the Alhari find difficult to ignore. But the weight of that moment was different from anything I had experienced before. She had known I would be in the room. She had known, because Elena Marin had known, had studied the treaty framework, had found the witness arbitration mechanism, had understood that the Alhari had observer status in all conclave proceedings, and had built her entire strategy around the availability of a neutral party that could not be pressured or bribed or dismissed. She had built her strategy around us. Around me, specifically, because I was the assigned human observer, and therefore the one most likely to have been watching. I sat very still in my chair. I am very good at sitting still. 212,000 years of practice. But inside, in the place that my kind reserves for private response, I felt something I had not felt since the early days of my assignment to human observation. I felt that I had been understood, not observed, not studied, not anticipated in the way that a strategist anticipates a piece on a game board. Understood. Elena Marin had looked at the galaxy's structure and she had found, within it, the one ancient and neutral party who could help her, and she had not petitioned us, or appealed to us, or asked us for anything. She had simply created the conditions under which the right thing would happen, if anyone was paying attention. She trusted that someone would be paying attention. I stood up. In 212,000 years, I have stood up in a formal proceeding exactly 3 times. Each time is in the archive. Each time changed something. The Veth Brood Council went very still. I said, in the formal continuance voice that carries the weight of everything we have witnessed, the Alhari continuance accepts the request for neutral witness arbitration. The assessment will begin within 72 hours. Minister Voss closed her document case. She did not smile. She simply nodded, once, and sat back in her chair. On my way out of the chamber, I sent a message to my senior counsel. Not a request, not a proposal, a statement. I said, escalate to full continuance attention. The humans are not reacting. They have been executing. There is a difference, and we should have seen it 3 weeks ago. The response took 6 hours. It was unusual. Normally my counsel was faster than that. When it came, it said, Agreed. Full attention authorized. What do you need? I sat down at my station and began composing my list of needs. And as I did, I looked at the map of human ships, positioned at every node in the Dominion's commercial network, sitting there quietly, patient and immovable, and I thought about a woman standing in a hallway at 4 in the morning, reading a document she had already read 47 times. I had been observing humans for 3 years. I was beginning to think I had not understood a single thing about them until this moment. I requested full archive access. I requested 3 additional witness observers. I requested a formal review of all El-Hari records concerning the Veth Assimilation Clause, going back to its original insertion into the treaty framework 60,000 years ago. That last request was the one that changed everything. Because when my research team began that review, they did not find what we expected to find. They found 16 other cases, 16 other species whose children had been taken under the Assimilation Clause, over 60,000 years, by a civilization patient enough to do it slowly, one child at a time, spacing the claims years or decades apart so that no single incident was large enough to constitute a pattern worth examining. 16 species, dozens of individual children, across millennia, and the El-Hari continuance had been present for every single case, had observed, had recorded, had said nothing. I sat in my station for a very long time. Then I began to write the testimony that I would deliver to the full conclave. Not because it was required of me, not because my council had authorized it, they had not yet, because 212,000 years of watching and recording and saying nothing had produced, as its result, a 16-entry record of harm that could have been stopped at any point, and was not, because we had convinced ourselves that witnessing and interfering were opposites, and that our purpose required the first and absolutely forbade the second. Elena Marin had built her strategy around the assumption that someone was paying attention. It was time to prove her right. On the 31st day, they moved me to a different wing. The new room was larger. It had a window that looked out over the facility's courtyard, where a small garden had been planted with species that were not native to this moon. Careful, deliberate choices. Every plant selected because it would grow in the facility's controlled climate, and because its appearance was calming, at least by Veth standards of calm. The garden was maintained with quiet precision. Nothing in it was ever allowed to go unruly or wild. Even the plants here were being shaped. I wrote about the room in my journal. I wrote about the window and the garden and the subtle difference in air circulation that told me the environmental controls in this section were calibrated slightly more toward Veth comfort levels than human ones. A difference of 2 degrees in the baseline temperature, a slightly lower humidity, the kind of adjustment that you would not notice if you were not paying attention, and that would, over weeks and months of continuous exposure, begin to feel normal. I was paying attention. What I was not paying attention to, not yet, was how tired I was becoming. It is one thing to understand that something is being done to you. It is another thing entirely to feel it happening and remain unchanged by it. The Veth did not use anything as crude as deprivation or pressure. They used schedule. They used consistency. My days had a rhythm now that was entirely Veth. Meals at Veth times, study periods that followed Veth cognitive load cycles, social time that was carefully structured around Veth communal norms. Every day the rhythm was the same. Every day it pressed a little more firmly against the shape of me, finding the places where I had not yet been molded to fit it. I began to notice that my thoughts were coming in Veth primary before standard. Not always. Not even usually. But sometimes, when I was tired, when I reached for a word without thinking, it came in the wrong language first. I wrote about it in the journal. Today I reached for the word window, and I thought through the Veth word first. I know why this is happening. I am not going to pretend I am immune to it, but I am going to write down every time it happens, because I want to know the rate. I want to know how fast they are moving. Liaison Proctor Vethsa was still my cultural mentor. I had grown, despite everything, into something like genuine warmth toward her. This was not manipulation on my part. She was a genuinely thoughtful being who cared, in her way, about the people in her charge. The problem was that her care and the program's objectives were perfectly aligned in her mind. She did not see the tension there. She had never been asked to see it. She taught me the Veth tradition of morning observation, A practice where you spend the first 20 minutes of each day in silent, methodical awareness of your immediate physical environment. It is actually a beautiful practice. I recorded it in my journal and I practiced it. And the reason I practiced it was not because I was becoming Veth, but because it was exactly the kind of mental discipline that helped me stay sharp in an environment designed to make me soft. I used their tools against the process they were designed to serve. I thought my mother would have found that amusing. On the 34th day, Owen found me in the study room and sat across from me without saying anything for several minutes. Owen did not often do things without a reason, and his silences were always communicative. I waited. He said, eventually, 2 more ships arrived at the outer zone yesterday. I heard a proctor say it to another proctor in the corridor outside my room. They did not know I was there, or they did not think I would understand the full context. But you understood the full context, I said. 9 ships now, he said, still not moving, still not blocking anything, just present. He looked at me. You do not look surprised. I am not surprised, I said. He leaned forward slightly. Kale, what do you know? I considered him. I had been considering him for weeks, turning over the question of whether to trust him the same way you turn over a piece of code looking for errors. Owen had been inside the Dominion system longer than anyone in the facility. He knew how it worked. He knew where the edges were. If anyone could help me understand what the witness arbitration process would actually require, because I had found the subclause, but I had not yet found the detailed procedure, it was him. I know that there is a subclause in the assimilation clause, I said, page 9 of the original 17-page document. It requires Elhari witness assessment of primary cultural identity markers. If I can demonstrate to a witness that I am still primarily human, in the ways that the treaty defines, the claim is invalid. Owen stared at me. How did you find that? He said. Unlocked terminal. How long have you known? Since day 19. He sat back. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, with a controlled softness that told me he was more affected than he wanted to show, I have been here for 3 years. Nobody told me about page 9. Nobody told me either, I said. I found it myself. If you had that information 3 years ago, would you have? He stopped himself. I did not answer the question he had not finished asking. It would not have helped either of us. The witness arbitration requires the Elhari to assess specific markers, I said. Language retention, conceptual framework, value orientation, things that can be measured against baseline human profiles on record. I need to know exactly what they look for, and I need to make sure that every one of those markers is as clearly human in me as I can make it. Owen nodded slowly. He was recalibrating. I could see it happening. The shift from the person who knew how to survive here to the person who was now thinking about something beyond survival. You are not just trying to stay yourself, he said. You are actively building a case. My mother filed 41 documents in 6 days, I said. She did not do that so that her son could sit quietly in a comfortable room and wait to be shaped into something else. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, What do you need? Everything you know about how they assess the markers, I said. Every conversation you have had with any proctor about the cultural identity evaluation process. Every document or reference you have ever seen that describes what they are actually measuring. That is a lot, he said. I know. It will take time. We have time, I said. My mother is making sure of that. He thought about this. He thought about the 9 ships sitting at the edge of Dominion space, doing nothing, being absolutely impossible to ignore. And then, for the first time since I had known him, Owen did something that I had not seen him do before. He smiled. It was a small smile. It was the smile of someone who had spent 3 years being very careful not to hope, and who had just decided, on the basis of insufficient but compelling evidence, to try hoping again. All right, he said. Let me think about what I know. Over the next 6 days, he told me everything. He told me about the 4 primary domains of cultural identity assessment that the Veth used. Linguistic processing patterns, which measured not just what language you used but how you organized thought within that language. Ethical framework alignment, which assessed whether your moral decision-making followed Veth primary or origin species logic. Social bonding patterns, which evaluated how you formed and maintained relationships, and what they called existential orientation, which was essentially a measure of whether you understood your place in the universe the way a Veth understood it, as part of a civilization that was larger and older and more important than any individual within it. That last one was where they spent the most time, Owen told me. Because the Veth genuinely believed it. They were not trying to break you. They were trying to help you see something true, something that their 40,000 years of history had made obvious to them, that individual significance was an illusion, that what mattered was continuity, and that the most meaningful thing a being could do was find the stream of civilization that suited it best and flow within it. They were not wrong about everything. That was the complicated part. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about what my mother believed, not what she did for a living, not her methodology, but what she fundamentally believed at the center of herself. And what I came back to, every time, was something she had said to me when I was 11 years old, after we attended a ceremony marking the 200th anniversary of humanity's first contact with an alien civilization. She had said, "The most important thing a person can do is pay attention, not to the big story, to the specific, small, true thing in front of them, the specific person, the specific moment. That is where everything real is. Specific, small, true. Not civilization, not continuity, not the great stream of history. The specific person in front of you. That was my existential orientation. That was as human as it was possible to be, and it was as different from the Veth framework as anything I had encountered, and I held it in my mind, and I held it in my body, and I made sure it was visible in every interaction, every conversation, every small choice I made in that facility from that point forward. On the 41st day, the Elhari witness arrived. I had not expected a witness so quickly. I had not known that Minister Voss had already invoked the arbitration mechanism because that information was not shared with me. I learned about it the way I learned about most things in the facility, by noticing a disruption in the normal routine and then working backward to find the cause. The cause was a very old being who moved like light moves through water, without apparent effort, without disturbing anything, and who appeared in the corridor outside the study room at precisely the time I would normally have been in morning observation practice. The witness was tall and pale and had the particular quality of stillness that very old things have, where their stillness is not passive but charged, as though they are simply choosing, at every moment, not to do anything. Its eyes, when they found mine, were the color of deep ocean. I had grown up on Conclave Station. I had encountered Elhari before, briefly, in corridors and chambers, but I had never been looked at by one. There is a difference. When an Elhari looks at you, you understand, without being told, that you are being recorded, not evaluated in the way a teacher evaluates a student or a superior evaluates a subordinate, recorded, as though you are being added to an archive that will outlast everything around you. I sat very still. I did not look away. The witness said, in perfect standard, with no accent at all, "Kale Marin." "Yes," I said. "I am Saratha, of the Elhari Continuance. I am here to conduct a neutral assessment of your primary cultural identity markers, under Subclause 9 of the Assimilation Clause." "I know," I said. A pause. "You expected this." "My mother prepared for it," I said. "That is the same as expecting it." Another pause. Longer. The witness looked at me with those ocean-deep eyes, and I had the distinct impression that something was being re-evaluated. Not me. Something larger. "Tell me," Saratha said, "about the cipher." I blinked. I had not expected that. "How do you know about the cipher?" I said. "I have been observing your mother for 3 years," the witness said. "I observed the conversation in the doorway. I observed your expression when she said those 3 words. I noted that you did not cry, and you did not reach for her, and you did not ask her what she meant. You simply remembered, and I want to know what you remembered." I looked at the witness for a moment. I thought about the journal with 40 pages of kitchen code. I thought about the word "found," written in the smallest letters I could manage. "She invented a cipher when I was 7 years old," I said. "She said it was for grocery lists in crowded markets. But she taught me every variation of it, and she tested me on it regularly for 12 years. And she told me, the morning they took me, to remember it. Not because she was grieving, because she knew I would need it." "And have you used it?" "Every day since I arrived here," I said. Saratha was quiet for a long time. Then the witness said, "I would like to read your journal." I reached into my jacket and took it out, and handed it over. 40 pages of a language that no one else in this facility could read. The record of everything I had observed, every change I had catalogued, every moment of resistance I had practiced, every time I had reached for a word and found the Veth one first, written down so that I could see the rate. Saratha read every page. It took approximately 11 minutes. I sat in the corridor and I waited, and the morning light through the windows was the blue-gray of this moon's odd sky, and somewhere very far away my mother was waiting too, in whatever room she had made her command center, patient and certain. When the witness finished, it closed the journal and held it for a moment. "This," Saratha said, "is the most complete piece of evidence I have encountered in 60,000 years of cases." I did not say anything. "Your mother knew," the witness said. "Not that you would find the terminal, not specifically, but she knew that if you were given the right tools, you would find what you needed. She prepared you to find it." "That is what she does," I said. "She prepares." "Yes," Saratha said, and there was something in the witness's voice that I could not name. Not quite sadness, not quite admiration, something older and more complex than either. "She does." The assessment took 4 days. At the end of it, Saratha filed a formal ruling. I was not in the room when it happened. I was in my room, writing in my journal about the quality of the light through the window, noting that it was the same blue-gray it had been every morning, and that I had never once stopped noticing how different it was from any light I had grown up under. The ruling was 47 pages long. The conclusion occupied 3 sentences of the last page. The first sentence said that the primary cultural identity markers of Kale Marin were assessed as intact and predominantly human in all 4 designated domains. The second sentence said that the consent condition of Subclause 9 had not been met at the time of designation. The third sentence said that the assimilation claim was therefore invalid and must be dissolved. Owen told me about it. He knocked on my door 2 hours after the ruling was filed and told me, very quietly, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and that small, careful smile on his face, that I had only seen once before. "It is done," he said. I sat down on my sleeping surface. I pressed my palms flat against the surface and felt the texture of it, and then I looked at my hands and they were shaking. Not from fear. I had not been afraid in a long time. They were shaking from the release of something I had been holding very tightly for 41 days. "When do I go home?" I said. "I do not know yet," he said. "But it is done." "It is done," he said. I opened my journal. In kitchen code, in the smallest letters I could manage, I wrote 2 words, "Coming home." Then I closed it, and I put it in my pocket, and I stood up, and went to the window, and looked out at the blue-gray sky, and the garden that was never allowed to go wild, and I thought about my mother's terrible coffee, and for the first time in 41 days, I let myself feel something completely, and without any management at all. It was not triumph, it was not relief, it was something quieter and more specific than either of those things. It was the feeling you get when you have been walking a very long and difficult road alone, and you look up, and you see, in the distance, the light in a window you recognize. Home, not the place, the person. She had kept her word. She always kept her word. She had sent me in with the tools I needed, and she had built the structure around me, and she had waited, patient as stone, for the moment when the structure would hold. 41 days. She had lasted 41 days with whatever that felt like from the inside, and I knew, because I knew her, that she had not spent a single one of those days in anything that resembled despair. She had spent them working. She had spent them precise and relentless, and absolutely certain of the outcome, the way she was certain of outcomes she had calculated carefully enough. I had been afraid, somewhere beneath all the patience, that she had simply let them take me, because she did not know what else to do. I understood now, completely, that the truth was the opposite. She had let them take me, because she knew exactly what to do, and this was it, and it had worked, and she had known it would work, because she had spent 8 years making sure it would. My mother was the most extraordinary person I had ever met. And in approximately 22 days, I was going to get to tell her that in person. It is important for me to be honest about my limitations. I have observed 212,000 years of galactic history. I have watched civilizations that made the stars tremble. I have been present at moments of such monumental significance that other species still tell stories about them, filtered through layers of misremembering and mythology, and I could correct those stories, could tell the true version in every precise detail, because I was there, and I remember everything. And yet, watching what was about to unfold with the Veth Dominion, I found myself doing something I had not done in longer than I could specifically recall. I found myself uncertain about the outcome. Not because the legal case was unclear. The ruling was clear. Seretha's assessment was unambiguous. The assimilation claim against Kale Marin was invalid and had to be dissolved. That was established. The law said it. The precedent, page 9, subclause 9, the mechanism that had been sitting unused in the treaty framework for 60,000 years, confirmed it. But the law and the reality of what the Veth Dominion would choose to do with the law were two separate things. The Veth Dominion was 40,000 years old. It had absorbed, assimilated, and in some cases simply outlasted every challenge that had ever been put to it. It had survived wars. It had survived economic crises. It had survived the kind of internal upheaval that erases younger civilizations entirely. Its survival was not accidental. It was the product of an institutional stubbornness, so profound and so deeply embedded in the Dominion's culture that it had become indistinguishable from wisdom. They did not change because they were pressured. They changed, when they changed, because they chose to, on their own terms, in their own time. That was the Veth way. A human fleet was not going to change that. A legal ruling was not going to change that. But something was happening in the conclave chamber that I had not anticipated, and it was changing things in a way that I could not have predicted even if I had been paying full attention. I was the thing that was changing them. Let me explain this carefully, because I want to be honest about it. When I stood up in the Brood Council chamber and accepted the request for witness arbitration, I was operating within my formal mandate. The witness arbitration mechanism existed. It had been requested. The Elhari continuance was the designated witness body. I had both the right and, arguably, the obligation to accept the request. What I did not have the right to do, under 200,000 years of continuance protocol, was what I did next. I went back to my station, and I requested a full archive review of all Elhari records pertaining to the Veth assimilation clause. Not because anyone asked me to, not because it was formally required for the arbitration, because I needed to know, because something about the pattern of what I was seeing, the 60,000 years of that clause sitting in the treaty framework, the way it had been used, the quiet and steady pace of it, had produced a specific and deeply uncomfortable intuition that I could not ignore. The archive review took my team 11 days. They were good researchers, all of them, and 11 days for a 60,000-year record is genuinely fast work. When they came to me with their findings, I sat in my station, and I read the full report, and I felt something happen in me that I am not sure I have the right language to describe accurately. Call it shame. The Elhari do not use that word often. We have a specific term, sharvithu, that translates roughly as the weight of having seen and not spoken. It is a concept in our philosophical tradition, not a common emotional state. It is what you feel when you have failed in the specific duty that is most central to your existence. 16 cases. 16 species whose children had been taken under the assimilation clause across 60,000 years. In every case, an Elhari observer had been present. In every case, the relevant treaty clause had been visible in the records. In every case, the witness had observed and recorded and said nothing, because that was what we did, because observing without interfering was the first and oldest and most sacred rule of the continuance. I read the case of the Lithani children, taken 4,000 years ago. I read the case of the Miran, 9,000 years past. I read 12 other cases, spread across the history of a clause that had been designed, I now understood, specifically to evade notice, by being slow and patient and individually deniable. The Veth did not think of it as harm. I want to be clear about this. They genuinely, sincerely, completely believed that what they were doing was offering those children access to something greater than what they had been born into. They believed in the Cultural Bridge program the way they believed in their own civilization, with the absolute certainty of 40,000 years of reinforcement. But believing something sincerely does not make it true, and watching something happen without speaking does not make you innocent of it. I filed my escalation request with the full council. I did not frame it as a request this time. I told them what I had found. I told them about the 16 cases. I told them that the El-Hari continuance had been complicit, through our silence, in a pattern of harm that spanned 60 millennia and showed no sign of stopping, and that I intended to present the full archive record to the conclave, whether or not they authorized me to do so. There was a period of silence from the council that lasted longer than usual. Then my senior council member, an entity even older than me, one who had been present at the founding of the continuance's modern observation protocol, sent a single response. It said, "What will you say?" I said, "The truth, all of it, with every piece of evidence the archive contains." Another long silence. Then, "You understand what this will do to the Veth dominions standing in the conclave?" "Yes," I said. "And to our own?" "Yes," I said. "And you believe it should be done anyway?" I thought about page 9. I thought about a 19-year-old boy, in a facility on a blue-gray moon, writing in a cipher his mother had taught him, counting the days his thoughts came in the wrong language first. I thought about 16 other cases in 60,000 years, and the El-Hari observers who had been present for all of them, watching and recording and saying nothing. "We have been witnesses for 212,000 years, I said. "We have been very good at it. We have been so good at it that we forgot it is not the same thing as being right." The council was quiet for a long time. Then, "Go ahead." I went to the conclave chamber. I sat in my observer's seat. Minister Voss was there, her document case on the table, her posture unchanged from every other session I had seen her in. The Veth Brood Council was there in full formal ceremony, all 7 members, their ceremonial carapace coverings representing more accumulated civilizational authority than anything else in the room. And then, unexpectedly, Elena Marin walked in. She walked in through the main entrance. Without ceremony, without fanfare, security moved toward her. She presented credentials. She was a registered conclave observer, she said. The registration was 8 years old. It had been renewed every year without fail. Nobody had thought to revoke it, because nobody had had any reason to revoke the observer registration of a xenobiologist who worked in the Dominion's Research Corps and had never, in 8 years, attended a single conclave session. Until now. Security let her through. She sat down in the observers section, 2 rows behind Minister Voss, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. She was wearing her work clothes. Not ceremonial dress, not the formal attire that most people wear to conclave sessions. She was wearing the clothes she wore to her research lab, a practical jacket, comfortable shoes, the outfit of someone who had simply come from wherever she was and had not stopped to change. There was something about that detail that made it impossible to look away from her. Everyone in the chamber looked at her at least once, and everyone looked away slightly unsettled, and I think the reason was this. She did not look like a woman attending a political proceeding. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere and was now ready for it to be over, because she had already done the work. The Brood Council's lead member acknowledged her presence in the way of someone who has decided, for strategic reasons, to pretend that a thing is not happening. I stood up. Silence. I began. I spoke for 4 hours. I do not often speak at length in formal proceedings. The El-Hari are known for brevity, for the precise and minimum number of words required to communicate the necessary thing. But the record I was presenting was 60,000 years old, and it required full context, and I gave it full context. I read case entries. I presented documentation. I traced the pattern across the millennia, case by case, each one individually defensible, collectively a portrait of systematic harm conducted beneath the notice of a galaxy that trusted the El-Hari to say something when something needed to be said. The chamber was completely silent for most of it, not the silence of boredom or disengagement, the silence of people who are processing something they had not expected and do not yet know what to do with. The Veth Brood Council's lead member did not move for 3 hours. It was the stillness of a very old creature in the middle of a recalculation that was going to take a very long time to complete. When I finished, I said, "The El-Hari continuance formally acknowledges our complicity in the continuation of this pattern through our silence." We do not ask for absolution. We ask for the opportunity to remedy what we can remedy now, beginning with the immediate dissolution of all current assimilation clause claims against minors of any species, pending review under subclause 9. 4 species on the council floor, beings who had long traded quietly with the Veth Dominion, who had long preferred to find the path of least friction, went very still in their seats. I watched them. I watched the specific quality of their stillness, which was the stillness of people looking at their own records and realizing they did not want to have those records examined. Ada Voss opened her document case. She placed a second set of documents on the table. These ones, I knew, contained the formal legal framework for the review she was now invoking, a framework that had been prepared, like everything else in this operation, long before this moment. She looked at the Brood Council. She said, "Agreed terms for dissolution are in front of you. 22 days for full compliance. The fleet stays until compliance is confirmed." The lead Brood Council member looked at the documents. It looked at me. It looked, finally, at Elena Marin, who was sitting 2 rows behind the minister, with her hands folded, and her expression, that of a woman who has been waiting for something to be finished for a very long time. It said, to the room, to no one in particular, "We will need time to review." 22 days, Ada Voss said again. The documents detail the terms. They are not negotiable. The session ended. I walked out of the chamber into the corridor, and Elena Marin was there, standing against the wall, with a cup of the worst coffee I had ever smelled, even by second-hand proximity, and she looked at me. I stopped. She said, "Thank you." I said, "The continuance owes this to far more people than your son." She considered this. She nodded once, with the precision of someone acknowledging a statement that is accurate and does not require elaboration. Then she said, "Did the assessment go well? Saratha's assessment of Kale?" "He kept a journal," I said. "In your cipher. 40 pages. She closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. 40 pages, she said softly. He noted the rate at which the environmental changes were affecting him, I said. He described every detail of their methodology. He identified the page 9 subclause on day 19 by finding an unlocked terminal. He maintained all 4 primary cultural identity markers at levels the assessment classified as intact and predominantly human. She opened her eyes. They were bright. "He is his mother's son," I said. She smiled. It was a small smile, private in the way that some smiles belong only to the person wearing them. "When can I have him back?" she said. 22 days, I said. She looked at the cup of terrible coffee in her hand. "I can manage 22 days, she said. She could. I had no doubt of it. I watched her walk back toward the delegate area, unhurried, completely herself, the xenobiologist, who had been a registered conclave observer for 8 years, and had never used it until the moment she needed it. I went back to my station. I sat down. I began composing the full formal statement of continuance complicity that would be entered into the official record. And for the first time in 212,000 years, I felt that I was doing what witnessing was actually supposed to be for. On the 22nd day, the Veth issued what they called a procedural correction. It was not an apology. The Veth do not issue formal apologies. They have a word, in their philosophical tradition, for the act of acknowledging that a procedure was incorrectly applied. It roughly translates as recalibration, and that is what they issued. A formal recalibration notice entered into the conclave record, stating that the assimilation claim against Cultural Bridge Asset Marin, Kale, had been reviewed and found to be non-compliant with subclause 9 of the treaty framework, and was therefore dissolved with immediate effect. It also dissolved, in the same document, the assimilation clause claims against 6 other minors currently held in Cultural Bridge facilities. The review of all existing claims would proceed over the following year, with El-Hari witness oversight, and any claim that could not demonstrate subclause 9 compliance would be dissolved. The document was 7 pages long. It used the phrase, procedural correction, 11 times. It used the word, regret, 0 times. I read the document in my room, 3 hours before they came to tell me officially. Owen gave it to me. He had a contact among the administrative staff by then, A Veth clerical worker who had expressed private reservations about the Cultural Bridge program for years, and who was now, with the particular relief of someone who has wanted permission to act, and has finally been given it, willing to share information she was not strictly authorized to share. I sat on my sleeping surface and read it twice. Then I put it down and looked at the window with its view of the carefully maintained garden. 22 days. It had taken 22 days from the moment Minister Voss put the terms on the table. I thought about the 9 ships that had been sitting at the edge of Dominion space, doing nothing, being impossible to ignore. I thought about the Elhari testimony that had reframed the entire conversation. No longer a dispute between a young species and an ancient empire, but a 60,000-year record of harm presented by the galaxy's oldest observers. I thought about the 4 species in the council chamber who had gone very still when they realized their own records might be examined. The Veth had moved in 22 days, not because the fleet frightened them, not because the legal ruling left them no choice. There were, I knew, paths they could have taken to delay and complicate and obstruct, paths that would have bought them years of continued operation. They moved because the calculus had shifted, because the Elhari testimony had changed the conclave's understanding of what the assimilation clause was, and because that change in understanding made the Dominion's continued resistance into something publicly indefensible, rather than merely inconvenient. They were 40,000 years old. They were patient, but they were also sophisticated enough to know when a position had become untenable. A young Veth administrator came to my door at the official hour. She was junior enough that this was probably her first time delivering a dissolution notice. She stood in the doorway and read the formal language in a voice that was completely steady and completely professional, and when she finished she said, in a slightly different tone, "A transport will be prepared for you tomorrow morning. You may bring your personal items." I had one item. I picked up my journal. I held it in both hands for a moment. 42 pages now. I had added one more entry after reading Owen's document. The last entry said, "Today the formal correction was issued. Tomorrow I go home." I am writing this in standard English because I want to mark the fact that it still comes first. It always came first. They were here for 41 days and they could not change that. My mother spent 7 years making sure they couldn't. And it worked. I put the journal in my pocket. Petra was in the corridor when I came out. She was 16, and she had stopped crying on the first day, and had not cried again, and she looked at me with the careful, studied expression of someone who has been practicing not showing what they feel. "You are leaving," she said. "Yes," I said. "Because of the correction." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about the others? The ones whose claims are under review?" "The Elhari witness oversight is formal now," I said. "Every claim will be reviewed within the year. Any that cannot demonstrate Subclause 9 compliance will be dissolved." She looked at the floor. "What if they can demonstrate compliance? What if some of us have been here long enough that the markers—" "The witness assessment considers trajectory," I said. "Not just current state. They look at the pattern of change, not just the endpoint, what you were when you arrived, what you were actively doing to remain that." She looked up, "Like keeping a journal." "Like keeping a journal," I said. She was quiet again. Then she said, in a voice that was very careful and very small, "My parents never filed anything." I thought about this. I thought about what the truth actually was, which was complicated and not entirely fair, and I decided to tell her the complicated and not entirely fair version, because she was 16, and she deserved honesty. "The Elhari testimony put all existing cases under review," I said. "Not just the ones where families filed claims. The review is of the clause itself, and how it has been applied. Your claim is under review because of the testimony, not because of what your parents filed." She absorbed this. "So the Elhari did it," she said. "The Elhari decided, finally, to speak," I said. "That is different from doing it. They spoke because my mother gave them a reason to. She built the structure that made speaking the right thing at the right time." Petra looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother sounds terrifying." I thought about terrible coffee and kitchen code, and 47 readings of a document, and a face that did not break. "She is extraordinary," I said. "There is a difference." Owen found me near the transport dock the next morning. He was not scheduled to leave. His case was among those under formal review, which meant a longer process, which meant more time in the facility. He stood with his hands in his pockets, and that small, careful smile that I had seen exactly twice. "This is not a goodbye," he said. "The review will resolve within the year." "I know," I said. "And when it does, I am going somewhere very loud and very crowded and completely human," he said. I laughed. It was a real laugh, uncontrolled, and it surprised me a little. I had not laughed since the day they brought me here. Owen put a hand on my shoulder briefly. "Tell your mother," he said, "that she built something very good." "I will," I said. The transport was the same class as the one that had brought me here. The same clean lines, the same mineral smell, the same narrow cabin, with a reading console, preloaded with material I had no intention of reading. I sat in the cabin and watched the blue-gray sky of that moon grow distant through the small window, the flat plains and the strange blue-gray vegetation shrinking as the transport climbed. I had been afraid, somewhere beneath all the patience, that when this was over, I would feel triumphant. I had imagined that I would feel something large and loud and decisive when the moment of release actually came. Instead, I felt the specific warmth that comes from finding that something you were not sure you could hold on to has, in fact, held. My own language, still first. My own framework, still mine. 42 pages of cipher that nobody else could read. A record of 41 days of refusing, quietly and completely, to be anything other than what I had been made to be. I fell asleep somewhere in the transit, and I dreamed, not unusually for me, about a hallway and a cup of cold coffee and a face that had not broken. When I woke up, I was almost home. The station where my mother was waiting was 3 hours from the docking port where my transport arrived. She had sent me the coordinates. She had also sent me, in kitchen code, a message that said, "Taking 20 minutes of observation practice before you arrive. Do not be early." I arrived in exactly 20 minutes. She was standing at the end of the dock. She was wearing the same practical jacket she had been wearing in the conclave chamber, which meant she had come directly from wherever her last meeting was without stopping. She was holding a cup of coffee. It was, predictably, terrible. She was smaller than I remembered. I do not mean that she had changed. I mean that the version of her I had been carrying in my memory for 41 days was the size of something very important, and the real person was always slightly more ordinary looking than the version you carry of them, until they open their mouth or move their hands, or look at you with those careful gray eyes, and then you remember that the version you carry was the right size all along. She looked at me for a moment, then she crossed the dock and put her arms around me, and I put mine around her, and we stood there for a long time without saying anything. When she stepped back, she looked at me with those scientist's eyes, the assessment running in real time, not physical, not that, looking for something subtler, the specific kind of damage she had been calculating for 41 days. I held up the journal. She took it. She opened to the first page and read for a moment. Then she closed it. Her hand was very still. 40 pages, she said. 42, I said. I added 2 more at the end. She handed it back. What does the last entry say? That standard English still comes first, I said. It always came first. She nodded once. That single, precise nod. The gesture of a scientist acknowledging data that confirms a prediction she has been running for 7 years. She held out the cup of coffee. It is bad, she said. It is always bad, I said. I took it. We walked toward the main station hub together, side by side, and she began debriefing me. Not how was it. She knew how it was. She had calculated how it was. She had designed the 41 days to be survivable, and they had been survivable. She told me about the El-Hari testimony, Saretha's archive review, the 16 cases, the way the 4 conclave species had gone still when they realized their own records might be examined. She told it like a briefing, flat and precise and sequential, the same voice she used when she was presenting research findings at a conference. I listened to every word. I matched her precision. I asked clarifying questions where I needed more context. We walked for about 10 minutes before I said, in a voice that surprised me slightly with how even it came out, "I knew you were working." She glanced at me. "The morning they came," I said. I did not look back. I thought if I looked back I would see you falling apart. But you were not falling apart. You were already working. She was quiet for a moment. I started working the day they filed the designation notice, she said. 6 days before they came. I had 6 days and 41 afterward, and I did not spend any of them not working. I know, I said. How do you know? Because you are you, I said. And because the moment I found page 9, I understood why you let them take me. You needed me inside the facility. You needed a living case. You needed the assessment to be possible. And you needed me to be the right subject for the assessment. And you needed me to have found the subclause so that I would know what the witness was looking for when she arrived. My mother looked at me. The unlocked terminal, I said. Was it Vethsa's mistake, or did you arrange it? A pause. I arranged for information about page 9 to reach someone who would leave a terminal unlocked, she said. Not Vethsa specifically, someone in the facility's administrative structure who had a contact in the treaty review office who received one of my 41 documents. I could not guarantee the terminal would be unlocked. I could only improve the probability. What was your probability estimate? I said. She was quiet for a moment. 63%, she said. I thought about this. 63% chance that I would find the subclause. 37% chance that I would not. In the second scenario, she would have had to find another way. She had probably been building other ways simultaneously. You are terrifying, I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Petra said the same thing, apparently. Owen sent me a message. What did the message say? It said that you told her there is a difference between terrifying and extraordinary, she said. There is, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of grief or exhaustion. The silence of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long piece of work and is taking a single breath before beginning the next one. The reparations fund, she said, returning to the briefing tone. It will be operational within 60 days. The review process for all existing claims is formally under continuance oversight. The Marin Accords. She stopped. The Marin Accords, I repeated. Ada named them that, she said. I told her not to. She named them right, I said. My mother was quiet again. The Marin Accords, she said carefully, as though trying the words out. The framework for the review. Subclause 9 enforcement. Treaty language reform. It will take years to fully implement. She paused. Would you want to be involved? In the long work of it. I thought about Owen's face when I told him there was a subclause. The moment of recalibration. The decision to hope again. I thought about Petra in the corridor asking about the others. I thought about 16 cases in 60,000 years. Yes, I said. I want to be involved. She nodded. We walked in silence for a moment. Then she said, the coffee really is terrible, isn't it? It is the worst coffee in the galaxy, I said. I have been making it worse intentionally for 20 years, she said. It is a calibration exercise. Precise levels of badness are very difficult to achieve and require constant practice. I looked at her. She was watching the corridor ahead of us with the expression she wore when she was being funny and did not want to admit it. I started laughing. Proper, helpless, uncontrolled laughter. The kind that you cannot manage because you have not done it in a long time and your body has decided it is going to happen, regardless of where you are or who is watching. My mother waited it out. Then she said with great dignity, the reparations documentation is ready for your review whenever you have recovered your composure. I will review it immediately, I said. Good, she said. We walked the rest of the way to her workspace together. And when she opened the door, the first thing I saw was the desk terminal, and the stack of documents beside it, and the single photograph on the shelf above the desk, the two of us, on a station viewing deck somewhere, looking at something outside the frame, both of us slightly out of focus, because neither of us had been paying attention to the camera. I had not seen a photograph of us in 41 days. I had not allowed myself to picture it clearly, because I had not wanted the wanting to interfere with the patients. I looked at it now. I am glad to be back, I said. She sat down at her desk and pulled the documentation toward her. I know, she said. Now, the reparations fund has 3 separate allocation structures, and I want your perspective on the prioritization framework. because you have direct experience that none of the committee members have, and your input will be more relevant than anyone else's. She looked at me across the desk. I sat down across from her. I picked up the first document. We began. 50 years have a weight that only certain beings are equipped to feel properly. I do not mean the physical years. I have lived through centuries at a time without particular notice. What I mean is the particular weight of 50 years when you have been paying close attention to them, when you have watched, in the kind of careful, present detail that my assignment had trained me toward, the unfolding of something that was not finished the day the fleet came home. The fleet came home. The boys and girls in the facilities began coming home. The review process was slow and occasionally contentious and ran long over its projected timeline, as formal processes always do, but it ran. Owen was released in 11 months. Petra's case, which required a longer assessment because she had been in the facility for 2 years before the review began, concluded 14 months after the dissolution notice. Of the 31 cultural bridge assets I had known in that facility, 27 were eventually released and returned to their families or their people. 4, including 2 who had been inside for more than a decade, were assessed as cases where the primary identity had shifted significantly enough that returning to their origin communities was no longer straightforward, and those 4 required a different kind of assistance, more complex, less clean, the kind of work that reminded everyone involved that the damage of slow and patient harm is not undone quickly. Those 4 cases made me angrier than anything else I encountered in 50 years of watching the aftermath. I am getting ahead of myself. The Marin Accords were formally ratified 18 months after the dissolution notice. They were 400 pages long. Every species with a conclave seat signed them, including the Veth Dominion, which signed in the manner of a civilization acknowledging a formal reality, rather than embracing a new principle, carefully, precisely, with a specific kind of dignity that was the closest thing to grace that their 40,000 years of institutional stubbornness permitted. Elena Marin was invited to the ratification ceremony. She attended in the same practical jacket. Cale Marin was not invited, because he was not yet a formal party to any of the proceedings. He attended anyway, as his mother's research assistant, which was a designation he had technically held for 3 years, and which nobody thought to question. I watched him in that chamber. He was 20 years old, and he had the specific quality of stillness that I had noticed in his mother. Not passive, but chosen. The stillness of someone who is taking in more than they are showing. He stood slightly behind, and to the left of his mother throughout the ceremony, and he watched everything, and I could see, even from my observer's station, that he was cataloging. The same instinct his mother had, the same trained attention. I thought, this one is going to do something significant. I am good at recognizing the early markers of significance. It is, perhaps, the most consistent skill that 212,000 years of observation produces. You begin to see the shape of what a person will become before they have become it, the way you can see the shape of a storm in the first change of atmospheric pressure. He did not disappoint. He spent 3 years in his mother's research orbit, learning treaty language, learning the conclave's procedural structures, learning the specific geography of galactic diplomacy, which bodies had real authority and which were symbolic, which relationships were founded on genuine mutual interest and which were maintained entirely by inertia, where the actual pressure points were and how they responded to different kinds of input. He learned all of it with the patience of someone who understood that the immediate crisis had been resolved, but the larger work had barely begun. Then he went to study, formally, officially, with the specific intention of becoming the kind of person who could do the larger work, with credentials that even the most skeptical conclave member could not dismiss. He spent 8 years. He came out the other side as Dr. Cale Marin, xenopolitical treaty architect, with a specialization in galactic treaty reform and a secondary focus on the intersections of cultural identity law and civilizational power dynamics. He was 29 years old, and he had the careful, deliberate bearing of someone who had spent 10 years choosing every movement precisely, and he was already starting to make the Veth Dominion's diplomatic corps nervous in the way that people are made nervous by someone who knows their files better than they do. I escalated his observation status to primary. My senior counsel, who by this point had a much higher opinion of human potential than they had held 50 years prior, approved the escalation without comment. I spent 30 years watching Cale Marin do what his mother had done for him, build the structure, quietly and methodically and years in advance, for something that would matter when the moment came. He published research. He testified before committees. He consulted on treaty disputes that seemed, to the casual observer, to have nothing to do with the Cultural Bridge Program, or the Marin Accords, or anything related to the case that had begun with a boy taken from his mother on a Tuesday morning. But they were all connected. Every paper, every testimony, every consultation was a piece of the larger argument he was building, an argument about the relationship between civilizational power and cultural identity rights, about the way that ancient and advanced civilizations could, without malicious intent, cause systematic harm to younger and smaller ones through the slow machinery of treaty frameworks they had designed. He wrote, in one paper that became widely cited, "The most dangerous form of harm in galactic diplomacy is the kind that does not feel like harm to the party causing it. The Veth Dominion did not think it was hurting anyone. It was offering something it genuinely valued. The harm was in the assumption of the right to offer it." That paper was published when he was 34. The Veth Dominion issued a formal statement in response. The statement was long and careful, and very measured, and, for anyone who knew how to read Veth formal language, constituted a significant concession of the point. I noted it in my log. Day 11,789 of Kale Marin observation. Subject has caused the Veth Dominion to formally acknowledge a conceptual limit on the authority of advanced civilizations, marking this as a moment of consequence. Elena Marin retired from active research when she was 63, though retired is perhaps not the right word for someone who continued to publish, advise, and attend conclave sessions as an observer for the next 20 years. She became, over the decades following the original crisis, something she had never sought to become: a symbol. Not of the specific case, though the case remained in the conclave's collective memory, referenced in lectures and policy discussions, and the occasional political speech about the rights of younger species. She became a symbol of a specific kind of preparation, the kind that begins before the crisis, that builds its architecture quietly and precisely during the long ordinary time before anything goes wrong. Other parents, in the years after the Accords, cited her, not always by name, sometimes just by description: the scientist who filed 41 documents in 6 days, the mother, who knew what page 9 said, the woman who stood in the doorway and did not beg. I watched her age. I watched the gray come fully into her hair, and the lines settle into her face, and I watched her move through rooms with the same unhurried precision she had always had, taking in more than she showed, prepared for things that had not happened yet. She outlived several predictions. She was 78 when she attended the ratification of the Marin Accords' first major revision, which extended the original framework to cover cultural identity protections for adult migrants, and not only minors. She sat in the conclave chamber in a different practical jacket, this one newer, though still entirely practical, and she watched her son present the final revised text to the full conclave, and her expression was the one she always had when data confirmed a prediction: satisfied, precise, slightly amused by the precision of the confirmation. When he finished presenting and the vote was taken, I watched her briefly close her eyes, just for a moment, the same gesture I had seen her make 50 years before, in a corridor outside the Brood Council chamber, when I told her that her son had written 42 pages in a cipher she had taught him when he was 7 years old. Today, I am attending the ratification of the full Marin Accords. The original framework expanded and refined into something far larger than its first iteration. 400 pages of treaty law that covers cultural identity rights, voluntary assimilation standards, neutral witness requirements, and the specific protections for minors that were the original core. Kale Marin is 49 years old. He has gray at the temples, and he moves the way his mother moves, carefully, deliberately, with that quality of patient precision that comes from having learned, very young, that attention is more powerful than force. He has spent the last 3 decades building this framework piece by piece, consulting, advocating, drafting, and revising, with the particular long-game patience of someone who understands that the important things take time to get right. He stands at the conclave floor, and he reads the preamble. The preamble is his. He wrote it himself, over the course of 6 months, revising it 43 times according to the version log that I obtained through the same formal observer access his mother established for herself 30 years ago. He reads, "No civilizational, cultural, economic, or political claim supersedes the primary bond between a parent and their child. This is not a human value. This is a moral axiom. Any species that cannot recognize it has not yet become what it believes itself to be." The chamber is quiet. He signs the document. 43 representatives sign after him, one by one, each with the specific, deliberate weight of a formal commitment that will be in the record for as long as there is a record. The Veth Dominion's representative is the last to sign. It is not the white carapaced ancient from 50 years ago. That being is gone now. Even for the Veth, time moves eventually. But the one who signs is old enough to remember the original proceedings, old enough to have been a junior council member during the crisis. It signs without ceremony, precisely. And in the specific quality of its posture, I can read something that is not quite the Veth philosophical concept of recalibration. It is something closer to acknowledgement, not of wrongdoing. The Veth are still not built for that kind of direct reckoning, and perhaps they never will be, but acknowledgement that the framework of the galaxy has shifted, that something is now true that was not true before, that a line has been drawn by a consensus too large and too formally established to be quietly walked back. I have seen that acknowledgement before, in various forms, across 212,000 years. It is what real change looks like at the moment it becomes irreversible. Elena Marin is in the observers section. She is 78 years old, and she is laughing quietly at something a Veth diplomat is saying to her. She has been on professional terms with several Veth diplomats for decades, a relationship that is not uncomplicated, and that she handles with the same careful precision she handles everything. The Veth diplomat is telling her something that she clearly finds mildly funny, and is trying not to show too obviously. I watch them for a moment. Then I open my observation log, and I begin writing the entry for today. After 50 years, I have written a very large number of entries about Elena Marin and Cale Marin, about the case, about the aftermath, about the decades of work and the incremental progress, and the setbacks, and the moments of consequence. I have a style in these entries, precise, observational, the formal language of the continuance stripped of anything personal. Today I deviate slightly. I write, "There are civilizations in this galaxy that have survived for 100,000 years and more. There are species whose records of continuous achievement span geological epochs. The galaxy tends to assess significance by age, as though duration were the measure of importance, as though what matters most is what has lasted longest. I have watched for 212,000 years. I have learned, or I am learning, a different measure. Significance is not duration. Significance is change that could not have happened without the specific person who caused it. The Veth Dominion would have continued its program. The assimilation clause would have continued operating. The 16 historical cases would have remained in our archive, unacknowledged, growing slowly into a longer list. The galaxy would have continued assuming that the willingness to watch without speaking was the same thing as neutrality. None of those things changed on their own. They changed because one person prepared carefully and responded precisely and trusted that someone was paying attention. She was right to trust it. We should have been paying attention before she forced us to. What I understand now, that I did not understand 50 years ago, is why the humans alarmed me in a way that no other young civilization ever had. It was not their adaptability, though they are remarkably adaptable. It was not their persistence, though they do not stop easily. It was not even the strategic quality of the response to this crisis, though that was extraordinary. It was that Elena Marin, faced with the most painful thing that can happen to a person, did not become less herself. She became more herself. More precise, more prepared, more fully the scientist who pays attention to the specific and true thing in front of her. The crisis did not diminish her. It revealed the full extent of what she had always been. I have been in rooms where wars were decided, and civilizations ended themselves with words. I have seen the full scope of what power looks like across 200,000 years of recorded history. I have never seen anything like a mother standing in a doorway, with her face completely still, releasing her son into a plan she had spent 8 years building, trusting him to be exactly who she had made him. She asked nothing of the galaxy except that it pay attention. We are paying attention now. That is what witnessing is supposed to be for. I close the entry. I look up. Cale Marin has stepped back from the signing table. He is standing with his hands in his pockets, a human posture, easy and unhurried, and he is looking at his mother across the chamber. She looks back at him. They do not wave. They do not gesture. They simply look at each other, and whatever passes between them in that look is private, too small and too specific to be visible across the distance between them. I have been taking notes on humans for 50 years, and I still cannot fully describe that kind of communication. The specific, wordless language of two people who have been through something large together and come out the other side, still recognizably themselves. I write one more line in my log. Entry 7,441,882. The Marin Incident, and what it taught the galaxy about youth. End of primary record. Subject status. Ongoing. Then I close the log, and I sit quietly in my observer's seat, while the chamber begins to fill with the particular noise of something having just been finished. Voices, movement, the settling of a room after a formal weight has been lifted from it. The Veth Dominion is 40,000 years old. The Alhari continuance is 212,000 years old. We have seen empires that made the stars tremble. None of us thought to be afraid of love. We have corrected that oversight now, and the correction is in the record, permanent and precise, and exactly the right size for what it took to make it real. It took one woman, one terminal left unlocked by a 63% probability, 42 pages of kitchen code, 9 ships sitting quietly at the edge of Dominion space, and 212,000 years of a witness finally deciding that watching was not enough. It took all of that. It was enough.
Wide open game. How are these earlies? That's a flagrant. Oh, I got a late and an early. 1 by 20, that's good.